Hey guys, I'm so excited to be here today with Antonia. And she and I do similar kind of work. A lot of you guys I know have interest in trauma because a lot of the work that I do with my students incorporates trauma. And her story is so unique and her work is so special and so needed in the world. So welcome and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
excited
so
to get started.
let's do it. Let's dive right in. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and what you do?
For sure. My name is Antonia. She said it, she didn't say it already. Um, I am a former acrobat with Cirque du Soleil. I also toured with a few other companies during my time as an acrobat. And now I'm working as a trauma informed coach, pretty much working exclusively with creatives, athletes, and um, people in the entertainment industry. Many of them have a history of complex trauma and have done a lot of therapy already, but they're really just trying to tie it all together. So, my trauma informed coaching is where they can bring all those pieces together in a place that really recognizes the way that those industries, that kind of background can have a massive effect on the way that you heal and then also the way that you cope. So, it was a niche I wanted to fill because I didn't really see anything like that when I was trying to heal from my own complex trauma.
Yeah, I think it's something that's like so incredibly needed. And you occupy such an interesting space where it combines the trauma-informed worlds where we think of as usually more of like, a mental health field with like the highest forms of athleticism and like athletic performances and circus arts, that's like no joke, especially performing up to that level professionally. So some of those listening might know or remember back in the old days I used to be really like avid acro yogi and I would play a lot and learned a little bit of circus arts, like dabbled here or there, but never anything up to that level. So I'm really curious to hear about how that kind of demanding atmosphere maybe contributes to being a traumatizing environment and how that can present itself as complex trauma, because sometimes we think about trauma as just like one isolated event or incident that happens and that kind of stays with you for the rest of your life. But that's often not the case in these kinds of environments, right? So, what do you think are the factors that kind of contribute to having this more complex trauma be present in these kind of high performance environments?
Definitely. Well, I feel like I should start by saying for me, my complex trauma, you know, started not in that environment, but it's sort of like it, those environments were where I escaped to in a way in order to cope. But then certain aspects of the industry ended up kind of compounding it. And so I think it depends what background you come from. Like it's a little bit different in like gymnastics versus dance versus like any other kind of creative field. But the things that are pretty much present in all of them are a very authoritarian style of coaching. So usually it's like the coach's way or the highway, and your personal and physical boundaries will be crossed over and over and over again, like for your own good, which can mirror an abusive relationship in a lot of ways. That idea of like, I'm doing this like for your own good because I love you, because you don't know what's best for you. And so from a very young age, that's kind of hammered into you that you don't know what's best for you. And that the best thing is just to let this adult who ostensibly has your best interests in mind to really push you past any of your body's signals. So you learn to turn your body's signals off. All of your cues that you're in an unsafe space. Those things get switched off because that's what you need to do in order to survive. That's what you're told is like a champion's mindset. That's how you get the best at what you do, is just to keep working past everyone else, keep working past your own limits. So there's that piece. The other piece is like an almost constant state of instability. I think anyone who's been in the arts or in athletics knows that it's like you're either traveling from place to place, constantly preparing for the next meet, or you're like fighting to get the next job, and like you get one big spurt of income, and then all of a sudden, for months at a time, sometimes even years at a time, you're having to stress out about meeting your basic living expenses, and you're in this constant state of survival a lot, whether you're in an entertainment industry. And then there's also this aspect of like deeply, deeply needing to be chosen. Like performing and for the honor of doing this job, even though you're like amazing at what you do. It's just, there's never this sense of being, there's very rarely the sense of being valued by the people who are hiring you. So it can transfer over into a pattern of dating abusive people, even if that's not something that, you know, maybe you grew up in a really healthy family environment and that wasn't really present in your parents. Because I know when we're talking about relationships, we often go, oh, what was your family like? And sometimes it's not your family. Sometimes it's like you grew up in a shitty industry that just loves to objectify and marginalize you. And so, it's like, it's a weird, and then there's the eating stuff too, like athletic eating, or like eating as an athlete, as I remember it now, really just mirrored a lot of very, very dysfunctional eating patterns. And so I ended up in this environment. You know, they always say like, oh, you ran away to the circus, but no one ever asks you what you're running away from. And so I ran away from my home environment into this other environment that was like equally chaotic, equally dysfunctional, equally. And because you're so in a bubble with all these other people who are like you, who are like, oh, we're special because we're in the circus, we're special because we're performers, you get totally isolated from any sense of connection to any healthier way of being, because that's like, you're really in your in-group.
Right. I hate to say that it's almost like the stigma of the circus freak, right? Like, I think, you know, in the modern times, it kind of like would claim that as a positive label, but there's sort of a stigma there, right?
Totally.
Because there's a very unique lifestyle. That's so fascinating. And thank you for sharing all of that too. And I'm hearing a lot of elements that even if you're not in a high performance athletic context, there's still other contexts that have some of the same pressures in those situations, right? So that feeling of what I'm hearing a lot of is the underlying theme of your autonomy is taken away from you. Mm-hmm. And like, you're not supposed to be able to make decisions for yourself.
Definitely. Yeah.
And that can be really, really hard. Even if you did grow up in a healthy background, you're absolutely right. Like, trauma is more nuanced than just, oh, something difficult happened. In childhood, we have to look at the environment and the circumstances and the people and the kind of forces that are at play here. And that's a lot of external pressure and forces. And I can certainly see how the natural response to that might be, well, I just need to push back as hard as I can. You know, and then you have those kinds of personalities that are like really go-getters coming into those environments and really driven people. And then it's tough because it sounds like that kind of drive is exploited, like, as you said, with this desire, it gets confused with this desire to be chosen of like, if I'm picked, then I'm worthy and my work is valuable and all this hard work is paying off. And, you know, if I work harder, then I won't be in survival mode anymore. And it's like this ongoing hamster wheel. And I feel like a lot of people can probably really relate to that kind of feeling. So what for you was really like the shifting point, or did you have kind of a breaking point in your career where you're like, I just can't do this anymore? Because we're seeing a lot more of these kinds of things come up with like the Olympics and Simone Biles and, you know, certain athletes dropping out of games and races for their mental health. And this is kind of like shocking and controversial and taboo to a lot of people. And it's interesting to see how, as a public, those athletes then suffer even pushback for making those decisions for their own health and well-being too. So I guess it's hard to ramble on for a bit, but I guess like, how does that all land for you? And like, what was your kind of breaking point where you're like, no, I need to create some boundaries around this for my own well-being?
Yeah. So my breaking point actually came pretty early in not even pretty early, like right at the beginning of me leaving circus school and going off to perform in a professional capacity. Like, I had the unique situation of like ending up in most people's dream job, like right out of circus school. I ended up in a Cirque du Soliel touring production pretty much within months of graduating. And so I spent like most of 3 or 4 years that I was there trying to figure out how I could survive instead. I mean, like, there were a lot of breaking points during the time that I was touring with them, and like pretty close to the beginning, my relationship with my fiance kind of imploded. I didn't know anyone on my cast that well yet. So I was very alone with that pain. And that same year, within like a few months of my relationship imploding, I lost a few friends to suicide or to overdoses. And it just, there's no support on tour. And it, if you try and talk to anyone about it, even from outside of the circus bubble, they're kind of like, well, you're living the dream. You're not allowed to like feel bad. You're living the dream. This is a dream job. I'm miserable. I'm allowed to be miserable. I work in an office job. You're not allowed to be miserable. So there's that extra element of like, no, fuck you. Like you're like a bougie white girl doing like a really awesome job. Like you're not allowed to feel, and that is like another unique aspect of how this can come into some of these things, like being a professional dancer, it's like you're considered so lucky to even have that position to begin with, that, which it is a privilege to be able to do work like that. And, you're still human and things still happen.
Right. Like there's this facade of like perfection and performance and, the need literally to perform up to a certain level. And then underneath that, you still have all these very, very human issues, and I'm really sorry to hear that you went through all of that. And that's certainly a lot of like grief and loss and big life transitions to navigate, while also demanding yourself to be of an at performance level, like constantly, so it sounds like really destabilizing. And it's unfortunate because I think we sometimes invalidate our own experiences or other people's experiences because we feel like, oh, well, we didn't have it as bad as that person, so I shouldn't be feeling the pain that I'm feeling, or maybe I should just power through it. And like we talk to ourselves in these really like harsh, punishing ways. And then if we stop and ask ourselves, like, where did this voice come from? There's usually some sort of voice of criticism that's coming from outside of us, whether it's from a parental figure or a coach or a teacher or some other authority figure, or even just some random like asshole in the Facebook comments. You know what I mean? It's like people
Totally.
feel like they can give us their opinions, their unsolicited opinions on our pain. And I feel like so much of trauma is just like reclaiming your pain story. It's like, and we as a culture have such a difficult time letting people have their pain. It's like uncomfortable for us to let them experience that because we don't want to be in pain ourselves. It's like we have this own denial. And I'm speaking just in generalized terms, of course, but we have this own denial. Or like in the yoga wellness spaces, sometimes it's like, oh, well, you're having negative experiences because you attracted that, like all this law of attraction BS, which is, I mean, maybe fun for like for a certain context, but like it's like taking a small truth and then stretching it into like the truth. And that's just not how life really works. And it also blames the victim of this traumatic incident basically for saying like you deserve this, or like because supposedly you're in this great life position or in this desirable position, then you're not allowed to feel pain. And that's not true, right? But then also that's the culture of those kinds of environments. So how did you feel like you were able to cope, or maybe what did you struggle with if you felt like it wasn't able to cope? Because I feel like a lot of times too, when we have these kinds of podcasts and things, it's like, here's the 3 things I did to solve all my trauma. And I think it's also good to know like it's never that simple, right? It's good to know like how people struggled. So share what you're willing to share and feels comfortable for you to share. But I'd love to hear how you were able to bring yourself through that transition and how that landed you into the work that you do now.
Definitely. Well, of course, there's certain pieces I'm still holding close to me and won't share, but for the bits I will share, circus and performing arts for me very much had been a way of coping with my own very dysfunctional childhood. So to suddenly have all that dysfunction land, it had been dysfunctional very like for a lot of the time that I was there, but less dysfunctional than my own family system. But to have all of that kind of land there while I was in this dream job, while I was supposed to be having the best time of my life was, obviously very challenging. And also it became easier to believe the voices telling me that I should be having a good time, because to sit with how much pain I was in and to really accept how much pain I was in, I didn't have the resources for that at all. So that's when I work with my clients, is the big thing we work on at the beginning is like developing the resources to really be with yourself. I did not have those resources. So I what I realize now
Sorry,
I was doing.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. No, you're fine. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I was gonna ask you just to quickly break down for the students or viewers watching or listening to this who don't know what it means to resource or find support system. Can you kind of break down what that means really quickly to find resource?
To find
or
resource.
How to tell if they have enough resource or not to face and heal their trauma?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, how would I define a resource? It's really something inside of yourself or outside of yourself that helps to anchor or ground you in a sense of being able to, in a sense of confidence that you can handle whatever it is that you're dealing with in that moment. So it's a sense of, I am capable of meeting this challenge. I am, worthy of receiving my own support. It's anything that grounds you in that belief and that, so that can be other people. That can be like really solid support network in your community. That can be a therapist, a coach. It can also be like sensations inside of yourself. If you have parts of your body that feel like really grounding and neutral, or certain images or memories that you hold that you can revisit when you're feeling really stressed, anything that brings you back to your center when you're wanting to grasp outside of anything outside of you to try and find stability, to remember that stability is inside. So that's what I'm referring to when I'm talking about resourcing.
Thank you. Beautifully put. Sorry to interrupt. Please go ahead.
No.
So how did you know you weren't fully resourced in your body? Like what signs and symptoms came up for you where you were like, okay, now I need to make this shift and I need to change something? When you mentioned how it was really painful for you to sit with those emotions.
Yeah, I didn't develop the language of healing or recognize that. Like I knew I felt bad, but I didn't, know that I was dealing with trauma symptoms until like years later. But I was in therapy, so it was kind of like, I don't know if anyone's had the experience of not knowing that they're traumatized with being in therapy for many years before they like go, oh,
exactly, exactly. Which is why I asked the question. It's like, how do we know? Because sometimes our day-to-day is just so normalized for us that we don't realize that we're living in a traumatized state or acting from a place of trauma. And especially when we're not resourced, right, and in this place of struggle, it's like, well, how do we even know where to begin? You know what I mean? Like,
it was such a slow creep. There really wasn't one moment. It was kind of just like, oh, I've realized I'm depressed and I didn't have a word for that before. Oh, I've realized I'm anxious and I didn't have a word for that before. And, I'm still in therapy and I'm still in healing. And there's still moments I have like that. I'm like, oh, there's that. Duh. Obviously things are like far more grounded place now. Obviously I'm grounded enough that I'm able to help others who are maybe in a position that I used to be in, or a similar position. But like I had an eating disorder, didn't recognize I had an eating disorder because so many of the people around me also had eating disorders, and it was just called like athletic eating, food restricting. We were getting weighed every week. Like I went through these massive binge and purge cycles. That's partly how I managed some of those feelings. It's just like feeling I had control over my food or putting all my energy into controlling my food. I also was like a raging codependent serial dater. And so date these, like, I would just get myself into the craziest dating things. So it's like when I went and sought therapy, it was mostly for those things, and realized, it was for what was underneath those things had to be addressed first. And I also just became obsessed with like my hair. I think this is a pretty common thing just because like in the performing arts, it's such a like appearance focused, in the same way that I was trying to control my food. I was like, I'm going to dye my hair platinum. I'm going to dye it red. I'm going to cut it like this. It was just this never ending project. So I got to focus all my energy on my hair instead of like tending to whatever was happening inside. But that's how I tried to cope. And it wasn't until like I burnt off all my hair in this like Mexican salon that she was like, honey, this isn't about your hair. Like, go get help. Yeah.
Oh man. That's tough when the hairdresser's telling you.
Yeah. Hair is like the classic. The classic.
It is.
Yeah, it was. Go on.
It's like we reach for something that we can control because we've sensed this loss of control over ourselves, and that kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the sense of a loss of autonomy or a real loss of autonomy in our own lives, or feeling like we don't have the resources and capacity to self-regulate ourselves, or we're just in this avoidance denial relationship with dealing with ourselves. And so it may not occur to somebody like that all these kind of disordered or dysfunctional behaviors come from unresolved trauma. And so I think we need to be really compassionate with ourselves and notice like why or when we kind of reach for these things. It could be substances, it could be food, it could be hair, it could be clothing, it could be
Also clothing.
relationships, intimate partners, sexuality. Like it kind of bleeds into all areas of our life. Like trauma is something that's too big for us to process in the moment, and so it just kind of like gets stored in the body until we have the resource to like slowly unpack it later. But that doesn't mean it's not there. It means it like kind of seeps out and gets expressed in these other ways. And so it's interesting how usually the maladaptive coping mechanism is what lands us ultimately in like rehab or therapy or physical therapy or something like that. But really underneath that, there's a wake-up call, and our bodies are saying, hey, there's a real underlying need here. Like this is the story of how it's coming out, but the real underlying need is like just dying for that connection. I'm dying for more of that embodiment and grounding and resource and presence, like you said too. And that's ooh, that's a big intense wave to ride, isn't it? Right?
Totally. And it's so interesting because it's like I've been in therapy for all those things for such a long time, and like they were sort of getting, it's like I was becoming more aware of them, but I wasn't fixing them yet because there was no focus on developing alternative resources for such a long time. And it wasn't until I sort of ground to a halt because of an injury and ended up in one place for more than like, like 3 weeks at a time that my PTSD symptoms hit like poof, and that I think that is a shock for a lot of people if they're like, why, when I am like objectively safer than I've ever been, are all these things kind of starting to happen now? I had no idea what was happening. Just starting to get the nightmares, starting to get well, I'd had the shakes before, but they were so much more present. And I started getting flashbacks and just everything. It was, and I didn't even know what I was flashbacking to at the beginning. I was like, there's so many images, smells, like, so it was totally overwhelming at the beginning. And I think, sometimes like if someone doesn't know how to, like if I hadn't already been in therapy at that point, I'm really glad I was, because it was recognized for what it was in the moment. But I can imagine if I hadn't been and I had to find therapeutic space from that space, that would have been very hellish. I'm glad I didn't have to do that. I was lucky in that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's kind of like a hidden, uncommon experience of people who've been traumatized and then, attempt to go find healing or go through their own healing journey. A lot of times in the beginning, it is like that, where it is very overwhelming and scary and it feels chaotic inside because we're like chaos. We've become accustomed to chaos inside and feeling that immense pressure inside. So it's like once we come back to safety, it's like we don't know what safety feels like in our bodies anymore. So then the safety feels like a threat because it's like that's something new, right? And our egos and our brains and our bodies will try to protect us by going back to what's familiar, even if we know what's familiar is no longer working for us. It's just a pattern that's inside of us, right? And we can't ever erase that pattern. It's going to be there. We just need to put ourselves sometimes into a new environment or new space or literally change the structure of our lives to support our healing. And I think that's the great injustice of being a trauma survivor is that it's never the person who's like doing the messed up thing that has to make the adjustments to their life. It's always the person who it's being done to who usually has to end up making the adjustments and moving mountains and stuff. So it's like at a time when you're not feeling resourced, when you're depleted, it's like you have to use all of your resources towards this healing journey. And then once you finally get to that place, it's like, whoa, this whole Pandora's box finally opens up, so that can be really overwhelming for a lot of people. So for those who are kind of just like starting out their journey and like they're hearing this, they're like, that sounds not very fun. I think I'm just gonna go drink some more.
Yeah.
What would you say to them, and what do you think would be helpful for them to sort of ease into this with and just knowing that it's going to be okay on the other side?
Yeah. I can only speak from my experience, but starting to move those pieces and starting to peel back that onion, even though it was like so overwhelming, felt so hopeful. Like even though it was so confusing every time I'd peel back a layer and then another symptom would come up and I'd be like, yeah, like I thought I dealt with that one. There's another one. Like, what's going on? It's like playing whack-a-mole with my trauma symptoms. It felt like, I can't like guarantee that. I also want to acknowledge that I was very lucky. I had a place to land. Like the company that I was working for paid for 12 therapy sessions, like through my insurance per year, which is just like so many performers don't have that. But it just, knowing that there was another layer that, eventually I was going to get to the center, and that those layers were going to become thinner, and I could feel it, like feeling that difference, especially once I started working with like a trauma specialized therapist, because I didn't know I needed one of those before. But when I got one, I was like, oh, like, thank God, because then we started working on resourcing, then we started working on, but yeah, like it sounds so like trite to say, but it does get better. Like it gets so much better. And something I've really found, without positivity bypassing anything, in my journey, was that like going through that fire, going through that darkness, and feeling the way it was uniquely qualifying me to help other people through that darkness gave meaning to my life in a way that like circus never did, because it was a way of coping for me. So like maybe circus is for some people, like not everyone in my cast was like messed up, for them, it really was like their meaning and their joy, and they found a lot of purpose through that. But like letting that go for myself and realizing, no, that had its purpose, and I'm not doing that to survive anymore. If I go back to circus, it'll really be from a place of deeply thriving and wanting to use that as a tool of self-expression. Feels deeply empowering. It's a choice now, not a compulsion. So yeah, that was a bit of a bleh.
Love that.
Like
no, that's
reflections.
great.
It is super hard, but knowing that there's another side to it, and that other side, might still be shit, but it's like a little bit different. And then like the other side of that's different kind of shit, but it's different. It just gets better, and you become more capable of meeting that every time. I rarely flash back anymore. I don't get nightmares as much anymore, but it's relationships get better. It's really one of those things where like every skill that you learn to heal one symptom ends up transferring to 15 different. So it really is like a knockdown effect. Like the more dominoes knock over, the more, in a positive sense, the more things start to constructively. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm so proud of you, of your healing journey. That's so inspiring. And I'm sure the listeners are super inspired by that as well, too, because it really takes a lot of courage and a lot of bravery to sign yourself up for that journey and stick with it, because there's a lot of, kind of setbacks that can happen, different pressures that come in. You have to work, caretake for all the things going on in your life. So it's really a lot to juggle, and it's very brave to just take this head on and seek out and find those resources, and then actually take advantage of them and use them, and not see yourself necessarily as weak or broken, but just as someone who's worthy of and deserving of support, like genuine support, and not having to go through that whole experience on your own. And that's one thing I really want to emphasize too, of like, trauma is not something that we should really be in a room by ourselves, like unpacking in a lot of detail, because a lot of times that can actually just rehash the trauma. And so we heal in relationship, whether it's addiction or trauma or whatever it is. It's best to co-regulate your nervous system with somebody else's nervous system who is grounded and resourced and capable of supporting you in that way. Now it's maybe a different discussion. We'll have you back another time to figure out what are some steps that people can take to do that. But I really appreciate you sharing your story. And to me, if I could just summarize the whole process, we talked through, quite the journey here, but if I could just summarize the process, it's a process of homecoming, of centering, bringing our energy back into ourselves, and of anchoring, getting grounded and centered, and then one of choice, right? If I could summarize it of those 3 steps, it's like we come back to ourselves, we find where our root is, we find some stability in our lives, and then from that stability and that grounded, centered place, we can make a decision about how we want to move on excuse me, with our lives now and how we wish to choose to show up and interact with the world, you know, and that won't take away the trauma. Unfortunately, we can't erase the trauma, but we can certainly resensitize ourselves to our bodies and understand that despite how bad it was, we're not erasing that pain, but we're just coming to a relationship of honoring with it so it doesn't have to rule our lives subconsciously anymore. And we can have the freedom to choose differently and show up differently for ourselves, for our relationships, and for our passions. And I think what's really inspiring about your story is that you've done like a complete 180 with your relationship to athletic performance and circus arts and all that stuff, where, like you said, it was a compulsion and now it's coming from a place of joy. And that's so beautiful to me.
Yeah, no, it was definitely a process getting to that place of having to fully let it go before I could come back to it. There was a long period where I just didn't exercise at all because my body was like, absolutely not. We're not even going to move. We're not even going to go, you know, we're just lying here. And having so much of my identity tied up in like
movement,
4 to 8 hours of training a day. I was like, what do you mean? This can't possibly be good for me. But I think it was needed just to find that stillness, just to find myself without that. Yeah, massive.
absolutely. And we do have these periods of blossoming and periods of fallow time in our lives. And especially as women, we can't always be constantly producing and, you know, driving ourselves and operating at 100%. I mean, nobody can really, but especially women, because our energy is more cyclical by nature. So yeah, so it's like we have to allow ourselves that fallow time. And if you've lived your whole life in achievement mode or go-getter mode, or I'm just going to power through this to make it through and do what I have to get it done, then that fallow time can feel almost like a betrayal of yourself. Like, oh, I'm not being productive. I'm not doing, you know, the work that I know that I'm capable of doing, right? Like there's this self-imposed guilt that comes in. And it's really hard to dive underneath that, but it's like really allowing yourself to rest and come to that place of stillness and integration is so, so, so important for healing trauma. And so that doesn't necessarily mean like take a nap all day, but maybe it does, you know, like whatever rest is rejuvenating for you. And it's so beautiful that you're able to come into a connection with your body and ask your body, what do I need? And follow that. And that's a beautiful practice of honoring, and something I really try to teach and share with my students as well too, of like, yes, we'll have our programming, we'll do our mobility rehab, you'll do your stretches and your poses and your exercises and your strength training. But before every practice, I want you to spend a few minutes just like feeling into your body and just asking like, what do I want today? And leave some room to follow that, you know? So even for myself, like I'll leave space and workouts to like do less if I want to, you know, and sometimes I'll go and I'll feel like doing more. And I let myself follow that too, if I want to be challenged a little bit more, but it's not like the onus isn't, you know, the onus is just on feeling good in the body and doing the things I need to do. But it is different when you put yourself into a professional environment where it's like a performance is expected of you, right? So for the people who are still kind of like straddling these situations where they want to give themselves more fallow time and rest, but feel like they're unable to for reason like outside reasons, they're going through, you know, a lawsuit or a divorce or, you know, all kinds of crazy life circumstances. Like, what recommendations would you have for them to at least get a little bit of nourishment and get started and being more resourced?
Something I talk a lot to my clients about is finding ways to be 1% more, rather than like I need to completely rest or completely restore everything or completely feel this feeling, like all of it right now in the moment when we're not resourced, when there's all these things going on. It's just finding like, you know, 30 seconds a couple times a day to feel whatever's going on underneath, just 1%. And I'll give them a little mindfulness exercise of like every cycle of the breath, every deep breath you take is like a little pulley going, and you can go down just 6 more millimeters and then lift yourself up. But like, you know, when we're in those places where there's still chaos happening around us, to get into that feeling and to be more embodied would probably like be re-traumatizing because it's just not enough around us to help us be okay with whatever comes up if we try and get in there. So yeah, just being okay with 1%. and finding
being
little
slow, being
pockets of time.
gentle.
You don't have to do
I
the
love
yoga
that.
retreat. You don't have to do the Vipassana. You can just, if you can like be on the bus, you know, there's like sweaty people all around you. Someone's like eating a tuna sandwich and you're like, okay, all right, how can I 1% feel this disgust? You know, just finding ways to be present with those feelings of like, where do I feel this disgust? Where do I feel this like annoyance at being on the bus? Can I find some peace in that? Can I find some centering in that?
Yeah, I love that. That's a great suggestion. I love that as an exercise and as a practice. That's something small that people can take into their everyday is just like a little practice too, you know, and like
it doesn't have to be the tuna sandwich, but you know, like, you can be in the bath and be like, these rose petals.
It's like a very personal, specific story. Maybe there's a story in there. Yeah, and it's like we're resensitizing ourselves too with that exercise. It's like we're letting the feelings come up in the present moment as they happen instead of trying to repress them or stuff them or like take them and push them somewhere else, right? So it's like, oh, I'm here right now and I'm with this feeling and it's okay to just let it pass. You don't have to, you know, jump onto that narrative and let it ride. We can get just 1% underneath it. I think that's such a great practice. So, well, why don't you share with us? Sorry. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I would love for you to share with us like how people can get in touch with you, where they can see more of your work, learn more about your work, because it sounds like you have a lot of really great exercises and recommendations for your students who are struggling with trauma as a result of or as they go through very high performance environments. So yeah, please share with us how people can get in contact with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can get in contact with me through my website. I have a contact form, and that is www.antoniadolhaine.com, which I'm guessing if there's a comment section or like I'm just going to point down to it, assuming
yeah.
YouTube where it'll be.
We'll post it.
Yeah, and I have an Instagram as well where I post content regularly, exercises, little kind of specific blurbs or inspirational bits around trauma that relate as well to the worlds of performance, athletics, art. You know, I also work with like graphic designers and that kind of thing. It's not all like athletics and entertainment. And yeah, for now, the only service I'm offering is one-to-one coaching and one-to-one breathwork sessions. Breathwork has been a massive part of my own practice. It's a lot gentler than some of the more intense interventions, and just giving ourselves the space to really be present with our body in a way that's non-threatening. So yeah, I offer both those things, and there's information about both of them through my website as well.
Thank you so much for that. And yes, I definitely want to validate and reiterate how important breathwork is, especially in the space of trauma, because breath is really that connection between our minds and our bodies. And one of the best ways that we can regulate as your breath is always with you all the time. And it's a free tool. So I'm really, really happy to hear that you also take a very breathwork based approach to working with trauma. So definitely go check out her website, connect with her on socials. Antonia, thank you so much for sharing yourself vulnerably and honestly with me today about yourself, your work, your story. Super inspiring to me. And I'm sure many of our listeners and viewers too. So I really appreciate your time. Go check out her website. She does amazing work, you guys. She's just like this beautiful, sweet, sweet soul. And we're all very lucky to have her with us today. So thank you. Enjoy your rest of your day. And I'll pop all of the links and stuff in the comments below the YouTube video for you guys to check out.
Thank you so much for having me today.
All right, take care.